Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's 10th Annual Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It's my deep honor to introduce our next speaker, Kritee Kanko, who will be speaking to us about islands of belonging and resilience in a sea of climate chaos. Dr. Kritee Kanko is a climate scientist, Zen Buddhist priest, educator, and founding spiritual teacher of Boundless in Motion, a nonprofit and a trauma-informed meditation community based in Boulder, Colorado. She is an ordained teacher in the Rinzai Zen Buddhist lineage of Cold Mountain and a co-founder of Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center. Professionally, she served as a senior scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, one of the leading environmental nonprofits in the world that is focused on confronting the climate crisis. She served at EDF for 12 years. She has also served as a faculty for many organizations for courses at the intersection of climate crisis, racial justice, trauma healing, and spirituality, including One Earth Sangha, Al Gore's Climate Reality, 350.org, Stanford University, World Council of Churches, San Francisco Zen Center, Mind and Life Institute, and Lama Foundation. Her experience is that identifying and being with our personal and ecological grief in the presence of a loving community is necessary in these times. She finds herself committed to serve and learn from young adults, LGBTQ, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Through her nonprofit and with her collaborators, she leads retreats and workshops that are at the interface of inner healing through silent meditation and grief rage sharing circles, including those only for BIPOC groups, and outer strategic actions for climate and social justice. Her articles and interviews have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Harvard Health, Yale Climate Connections, and California Public Radio. Join me now in warmly welcoming Dr. Kritee Kanko.
Thank you so much, Tia. This is so wonderful. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am going to share my screen. I want to start by saying that even though the title said Islands of Belonging and Resilience in a Sea of Climate Chaos, I think all of you would agree we are not just facing climate in isolation. We face all the layers of crisis, and I'm going to posit that we can start using a phrase, polycrisis, to look at these layers of trauma that we face as human animals. Yeah. So I want to invite in chat right now, because we want to do embodied learning through this next hour and a half. If anyone feels like sharing, what do you feel? Maybe where do you feel in your body what you feel when you think about climate crisis, maybe what is unfolding in the Middle East and other crises? So you can take a moment, maybe even close your eyes for a second before you start typing. Just 2 or 3 words. If we were making like a word collage, what words would come up for you? Anything and everything will be welcome. I'll see what came up. Unsafe, grief, heavy, heartache. Someone said tightness in my chest. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for naming. Yeah, deep emptiness, loneliness, As I read these, my own body resonates. It's like a tuning fork has been set in action, and my own grief about these things wells up. Okay? So real, so important to name this, acknowledge this. This is the ground, this is the soil from which our actions will arise or not. Yeah? Thank you. We can stop now. Yeah. Yeah. And anger and determination too. Yeah. Okay. So when I can form a word cloud, what I usually hear people is a combination of all of this. Yeah. Some people just use the word climate feelings. So what I'm going to share maybe in the first half of the talk is probably going to bring up a little bit more of some of this. And before we launch into all of that, I want to do a grounding practice, okay? To ground our nervous system before we go into discussing polycrisis. So just give me 3-4 minutes to lead this guided practice. Wherever you are seated, or maybe you're lying down, which is welcome too, see if you can elongate your spine. If you're sitting, can you imagine that your spinal cord is growing into the cushion or chair you're sitting on? And it's going down deep into the soil. You decide how deep you want to imagine these roots of your spine going. It could even be that you imagine yourself like a tree, a giant tree, tall tree, rising up from the surface of earth. And there is so much heartbreak, loneliness, sense of loss, and at the same time, you and me, all of us, have been brought here by the consciousness in 2023. Let your spine be elongated. You rise in defiance and resilience like the most courageous of our ancestors. Not all our ancestors were wise and compassionate, but some of them were incredibly resilient. They survived in caves. They survived in wilderness when the elements didn't support them. They survived wars. They survived genocide. And we are their children. So call in the lineages you want to call. Lineage of change makers, activists, critical thinkers, philosophers, artists, gardeners, cooks, artists, singers. Their defiance is also with us. And last, calling in beauty, calling in diversity, calling in the dance of our ecosystems, the elements of air, fire, water, earth. And the last piece, just if nothing else, hear the sound of your breath going out. Okay, I'm going to call you back now. Polycrisis. There is an amazing institute called Cascade Institute, and they came up with this definition of polycrisis. They say that includes lingering impacts of the pandemic, the geopolitical conflict that is just all over the news, which is due to political instability, civil unrest, economic insecurity, religious extremism. I identify with that coming from India. Declining democratic institutional legitimacy, and devastating weather impacts due to climate heating, volatility in food and energy markets, on and on and on. And the last one that is usually not counted by academic circles all the time is human trauma, the scale of human trauma itself, the mental health crisis itself as a part of the polycrisis. That's what I'm going to start with. And once again, as in other parts of the talk, I'll invite us to take deep breaths. In United States, kids, 1 in 3 have faced domestic violence. 1 in 4 had alcoholic relatives, usually parents. 1 in 4 have been beaten up so that they have marks on their bodies. And 1 in 5 were sexually abused. I know when I go over these things, sometimes people say, I feel like I've become a statistic. I don't show this to say our experience can be journalized and become a statistics. I share this to say the scale of trauma kids come into the world with in general. And then on top of it, there is racial and religious trauma. There is gender-based violence. There is economic, and there is climate trauma. Okay. All of these are huge. Some people face multiple things impact their body, and some of us maybe just 1 or 2 of these. This is a lot, and I want to invite comments in the chat. Were these numbers surprising for you? You can just say yes or no. And if I ask you, maybe very short sentence, what impact does this level of trauma have on climate or justice movement? You're sitting in a group of, in a meeting, and there are 60% of people who have faced one of these traumas as children. What impact can you think of? Numbers are not surprising. Climate justice movement needs to include trauma care. Yeah, some people say these numbers are surprising. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this level of trauma impacts our capacity to organize and act. Okay, thank you. Yeah, many are too focused on their survival to deal with climate or anything else, any other crisis. We can stop now or maybe take one or two more. But you see, for many people, these are not surprising, and some said these were surprising. When I first started paying attention to it, the scale of it was surprising for me. But when I thought more about it, it was like, yes, that makes sense. In India, sexual abuse numbers are as high as 50-60% higher for women always. People in, yeah. Oh, and someone just said beautiful. Those of us who have overcome trauma or have had the opportunity to have what we call post-traumatic growth have a special responsibility to show up. But everyone gets tired. Everyone deserves rest. Okay. Okay, so we can go now. One conclusion I derive from this is that there isn't going to be a special group of non-traumatized people coming up to build the movement, right? We are needed. The other important thing is to see, especially in the grassroots movement, trauma really undermines us. It undermines our capacity to belong. Relationships are hurt very badly. And another important thing that I'm passionate about is that one-on-one psychotherapy is already not available at the scale that we wanted. And going forward, that is not going to be enough at all. We need community resilience, right? One hard message I want you all to go back with is we need to develop capacities within our communities to deal with these layers of trauma, which are only escalating. Okay. Now, shifting gears, some of you might have a hardcore science background, and some of this will feel like very repetitive, but I want to go over some things. And I might go over some things very quickly, not give you time to read the entire slide, just preparing your nervous system. This slide is what I call EKG of Mother Earth. You know, just like when you have a heart issue and you go to emergency room and doctor does these scans. It goes back to 800,000 years. And it shows you concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And right now we are at 0. Okay, so 0 is 2023, and then you go back 800,000 years ago. Human beings evolved between, somewhere close to 200 and 100,000 years ago. We have never seen the level of carbon dioxide we have right now. We are close to 420. And for most of human evolution and way before that, we were between 180 and 280. If you see this, you would say Earth is having a deep crisis. And I know many of you have seen this. Okay, this is just climate. Now, if I go to ecological crisis, birds are vanishing. Insect numbers are collapsing to a level that it's gonna threaten our food production. I don't intend for you to read every bit of it. I'm just highlighting some details. And then in terms of biodiversity, this is old. This is already 3 years old news now. 1 million plant and animal species are on verge of extinction because of Anthropocene. And the last big point here is about how we are treating our animal kin, non-human animal kin. This chart is showing you for every 100 grams of protein that different food categories give us, what's the amount of greenhouse gas emission. So you can see the vegetarian and vegan options have zero or sometimes even negative emissions. And as you go towards red meat, you have more and more greenhouse gas emissions associated with non-vegetarian diet. The violence of this isn't always fully clear. So there's another statistics I want to give in here. If you look at weight of all the mammals, only about 35% is human weight. 60% is livestock. And wild animals are only 4%. Just a few decades ago, wildlife was like 90%, right? We have drastically impacted our non-human kin. I will bring in indigenous worldviews later in this talk, but in our quest to have specific kinds of diet, we have just changed ecosystems very drastically. Okay. I want to take another breath myself and invite all of you. If you are taking this information in and you are not already in too much trauma, this brings up grief if you're not blocking it, if we are not blocking it. If you're not in a rush, if you're not commuting right now, if you're not trying to stay safe. And I want to honor that. Okay? Okay. So now, another question that I usually get as a climate scientist is it game over? Is it too late? There's all of these extinctions and calamities and chaos and collapse on the way. My answer is a firm and clear no. It's not over. Okay? Why do I say that? I'm going to go over something called a map of tipping points on the planet. It's going to look like a complicated slide, but I'll tell you the main points. Just like human beings have vital organs, yeah? Earth as a system, you might want to use the word Gaia, has vital processes, systems, call them vital organs if you like, but just for the sake of analogy, they are important. And if those systems fail, the whole planetary process suffers. So here are the processes. As I said, complicated slide. I'll just point out two things here, maybe three. One, look at Arctic and Antarctic at the top and at the bottom. Okay? And you look at Amazon rainforest, which is called the lung of the planet. And then you can see things in red, which indicates circulation of the oceans, the dance of the waters. Arctic sea ice tipping process has already tipped. What I mean by tipped is that no matter what we do today, even if we stopped all the emissions, Arctic summer ice is going to disappear in a few years completely in the summers. There's nothing we can do to stop it. But Amazon rainforest is just on that verge of tipping. It fixes a lot of carbon into the forest, it sucks carbon out of the air and it instead releases oxygen. But scientists have been increasingly measuring emissions and saying, no, we are slashing and burning so much that instead of absorbing carbon, this forest, this amazing ecosystem is also releasing carbon. But you see, there are tens and tens of such processes, vital organs processes, which have not yet tipped. There are some which are on the verge of tipping. What I'm trying to say here is that it is not too late to act, even though we have very steep challenges ahead of us. When we read news about the conflicts going on in our planet, and it is disappointing, it gives me, I've reached point of really deep sadness and frustration at this madness. Why aren't we dealing with the planetary crisis? We are still engrossed in this deep violence, because what we need to do is really steep. I'm not going to explain everything on this slide here, but you can see that if what we need to do is follow these pathways, ideally we would follow the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So we are going from year 2000 to 2100, and on the y-axis is emissions in billion tons. And we need to go down from the red scenario, which is where we are right now. We need to go to the blue dotted lines. For that to happen, I'm going to invite comments in chat again for those of you who've thought about this. Give me two numbers. One is, what is the footprint of an average American, all of us included? How many tons or pounds of carbon dioxide do you currently produce in a year? And how much does it need to be by 2030 for us to have a balanced, climate sane planet? Okay? So you can say, I produce 1,000 tons a year now, and it needs to go down to 500. Or you can say, I produce 10 tons now, and it needs to go to 5 tons. Take a guess. It's close to 15 tons per person, and it should go down to 5. Okay? Anyone else? 20 down to 2. 10 down to 1. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. You're all kind of in the right range. 5 is on the higher side. So these estimates keep changing from year to year. Some people include some greenhouse gases and not others. But for an average person who has an academic life and you're taking few flights a year, you're doing some travel for conferences, or even if you're a student, you're going back and forth between your hometown and university, I would say 20-25 per year is common. And it really does need to go down. In an ideal world, it would be 0, because we are aiming for 0. But even if we did emit something, it should be 1 or 2. Okay? So here is what needs to happen for us to have climate sanity. If you count in pounds, we need to go down from about 60,000 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents each year to about 5,000. If you go from tons, it's about from 25 to 30 tons to 2 tons. Okay, so these are different units. And none of us can make these changes by ourselves. That's why climate activists keep saying this is a 132 trillion pound problem. It's like 130 trillion pounds or 60 billion tons. Again, 2 different units. I hope this is not too confusing. But to do this work, we have such steep challenges that we are nowhere close to meeting, even though there has been promises. We should have no fossil fuel infrastructure, keep it in the ground. We should put it back in the ground by building soil, carbon, and forests. We should have very restricted private transport. We need to go let go of meat industry and go plant-based food. And we need to have very, very shared communal life where we share resources, we share cars, lawnmowers, all these gadgets that we need. And this brings up climate grief. As people already said earlier in this session, when we think about this impossibility that we are facing, it naturally brings up a lot of anxiety, grief, rage. And depending on who we ask, 50 to 70, some polls say even as much as 80%, especially if you look at young folks, are extremely or somewhat anxious about climate. So that adds to the layer of trauma you came into adulthood with. Okay? So what am I saying? Whatever we do, we have to take care of trauma. And the last half of the talk will talk about how do we create frameworks to do that. But before we go there, last piece here. We are in the middle of several geopolitical conflicts, heart-wrenching, just genocidal violence. But if you go back to climate issue, who will pay for solutions? People say China and India emissions are increasing. And if you look at this chart, we are going from about 1750, 1800s, where emissions were really close to zero, and we are in 2021 here. You see, if you look at emissions right now, China's emissions in just 1 year are quite high. And India is number 4 or 5 right now, but it's a significant part of the pie. But if you look at cumulative emissions, look at the size of these cumulatively. United Nations and European Union are huge. For next few minutes, I'm going to focus just on India. India's emissions might be at number 4 right now. Okay, this looks a little bit smaller than number 4, but trust me if you can, that India is number 4. Okay, so it's United States, China, EU, and then India in terms of rankings. But if you look at India, India has about 245 million households, and out of those households, 60%, 180 million households, or say 900 million people, that's, at least twice United States population, they live in rural households. I have done this work for 12 years of my life. I just left my mainstream climate movement job with an environmental defense fund. Rural households in India are nowhere like rural households in the US. Yeah? People really make $2 a day. They grow food on 1 acre big farms. 1 acre as opposed to 5,000 or 10,000 acres for a single farmer in the US. They don't live in what are called pakka houses. Pakka houses means made with cement and bricks. They might have houses that they have to repair every season. This is the water situation. This is a well from the state where our prime minister comes from, Gujarat. It's mostly women who walk for hours and hours to get 2 pots of water. This image is actually more than 10 years old now. Even if India's emissions are increasing to meet the increasing energy needs of the population, how will India agree to pay for solutions? Is that making sense? These are the kind of farmers I worked with for over 12 years, trying to help them understand what climate crisis is. They are tilling their land using animals, right? Their plots are so small, they can't use tractors. So I try to spend time explaining to them there is a thing called climate crisis. Here are the potential solutions with which you can decrease your emissions, and maybe somewhere some climate market, carbon pricing system will bring you some resources that will lift you out of your poverty. What I want to shift to now is unevenness of trauma loads that we have. We talked about climate grief earlier, but now there is increasing amount of research and narrative around people of color experiencing climate grief differently, more deeply than people of European descent. There is an amazing article in Scientific American. Sarah Ray says, climate anxiety seems more applicable to folks who haven't experienced existential threats before. Communities that have experienced colonialism, slavery, genocide, all these layers of injustice before, tend to view climate as another layer of threat, but not the existential main threat. This is a point which isn't always appreciated. People in India, farmers in India, don't have the luxury to think about climate the way we do. They have other existential threats. Just like someone afraid of genocide or actually experiencing genocide right now will not have bandwidth to think about what's happening at the planetary level. So with all of this, I'm going to focus my attention on the bottom part of the slide. How do we create conditions where we can see each other's trauma while knowing our trauma loads are different? That is a fundamental challenge. We are not hearing each other. We are not healing up. Our communities don't have the capacities to belong, to solve conflict, to move beyond trauma, because we get stuck in, some people call it trauma Olympics. My trauma is more than yours. Jewish trauma is more than Palestinian trauma. Yeah. Russian trauma, you oppressed us, that group oppressed us, and then this group is not hearing me. It is mind-boggling. I don't have fixed answers, but we'll talk about some possibilities. Okay. There's another amazing researcher called Ian Haney Lopez. Is a Berkeley law professor. He's done phenomenal work. he has some very good YouTube talks you could look at, but he says the most important thing you can do to strengthen climate movement is to fight racism within yourself and outside of you. I will not go through his entire argument, but he has said this because he knows how these systems of oppression and racism in particular take away our collective power. And to be able to fight this racism within and outside ourselves, we have to address this beast of trauma. This and not just beast of trauma, but these differences in trauma loads, differences in kinds of traumas we face. And he also says, it's very hard message. It has always been a hard message for me because I feel urgency around climate. He says you can't solve for climate now and then come to racial healing in a few decades. It's very hard for some people, and I imagine it might be for some of you. Okay. You have heard this before. I'm going to go through this quickly. BIPOC folks have caused least harm when it comes to climate. They are suffering the most and will suffer the most. To this day, they are a side actor in environmental NGOs. And then in the last half an hour now, when we switch gears, you'll see how when people of color, especially Black and Indigenous folks, when they have been released from grips of their traumas, they have profound teachings that all of us need for our collective survival, including trauma healing techniques. It's a weird circular thing that I'm gonna bring to you later. We don't have to have pity on people of color if there are any people of color in your communities, or we don't have to have pity and help them, reach justice because then we will be good people. We have to do it because they are holders of wisdom that we all collectively need. Their cultures and their ancestral knowledge is the key to live in harmony with the living earth. And they have called for repair. They have called for protection for crimes. This is the theme that I'll come back to in my last few slides. Okay. Let's take 2 deep breaths. And when we move to islands of belonging, right? How do I think we can begin to grapple with these layers of trauma? First thing, it's a painful realization, but I have come to accept that we will face more and more chaos and collapse in the coming decades. Even if we stopped all the emissions, even if we started acting wisely on all geopolitical fronts, we have set enough things in motion that all of Arctic is going to melt and so on, right? And the sea levels will rise. Trauma loads will actually go up before there is possibility of them going down. And so the image that I call upon, which is also refers to the title of today's talk, is that we can create islands of belonging. Not that these islands will be disconnected from each other, I hope not, right? But these islands where our wise, compassionate frameworks are holding us together, even when there is madness, chaos, and collapse raging on around us. Now, how do we create these islands of resilience? We have to, as I have referred to earlier in the talk, we have to learn to belong. These are two of my favorite images. You see, ants are collaborating to cross a bridge. There is a school of fish on their own, on its own. A single fish would be too small, but together they form. They are a formidable force. And to belong, we have to take care of our, as I have said earlier, we have to take care of our trauma, which a lot of the time is internalized shame, which gives us desire to dominate someone instead of connecting with them and trusting. And trauma, I have said in several of my articles, trauma becomes an engine of oppression, which traumatizes us more. So what are the short-term and long-term ways to take care of our trauma? And I know this summit has probably, you've already been, soaking in different pathways. And then each of us is unique and we choose things that work for us, that are possible to bring in our lives. So I'll go over the short-term ones quickly. If someone is having a panic attack, I was told, actually, it's coincidence that it was someone whose daughter is in Israeli army, and they said when people fighting have panic attacks, it's hard to kill someone. We might not like the oppressor. We might think they are the oppressor. They are oppressing us, but their so-called soul gets fractured when they drop bombs. People in military have panic attacks. The first thing is to hold their hand and ask them to have really long exhalations, really elongate your out breath. Mindfulness, singing, humming, chanting, all of these ancestral traditions have deep impact on our nervous system. Foot massage. We don't do these things these days, but my home country, the Ayurvedic tradition, you really spent time massaging your feet and even your body with oils that are extremely calming. They have, just for me, such good immediate impact. There are several practices I do with bringing up safe images of wise and compassionate ancestors, memories from our lineage that within minutes can calm down the nervous system. And of course, there is social connection and laughter. Okay? But my favorite go-to practices, ceremonies, which I have found build community power. Like build community power. It's not just me doing it with 1 or 2 people, but more like 20, 30, 40 people. It's what I call community level grief ceremony, right? If there was chance to meet you all in person, I would say, let's gather in a room, create altars, and let's do this together. And I like to do a few a year myself, which is to really honor our primal rage, our inner screams, that raw pain that many of us never have chance to express because we didn't have skilled therapists. The harm that happens to us happens because our community could not help us. So we feel alone. There's deep spiritual loneliness associated with trauma. I did not deserve to be helped. I was bad. World abandoned me, parents abandoned me, community abandoned me. And so, because the trauma happened in the context of community, healing or post-traumatic growth also is very powerful when it happens in community. Instead of one person watching you, there are 15 people nodding their heads. Sweetheart, I went through the same pain. The nodding of people, they're humming with you, their body language can be supportive if you create a wise container. Creating the container is very important. You have to create the conditions for that to happen. So I place a lot of importance on community grief ceremonies. I have found amazing power emerge from them, amazing sense of belonging and solidarity. At first, you do these things with people who have similar experiences. So people from Israel do it in one room, people from Gaza do it in one room, people of color do it in a different room, and white folks do it in a different room. But eventually, after few such kind of affinity group circles, there is possibility of bringing people in mixed groups. We don't mix them up early on. Bring them together after initial work has been done in affinity groups. So there is basic safety in the body. Okay. I also lead meditation retreats and see enormous shifts happen in residential meditation retreats. Meditation retreats can include community level work or not. A lot of the meditation retreats are silent, so they are more individual work that's with the teacher. Of course, there is trauma therapies, those of us who have money, resources, good therapist. There is longer term, all of these call for developing the muscle of vulnerability. There is healthy diet, and then the last piece is really important here. This is what I put in the category of indigenization. As a scientist, if I wear my academic hat, we have been trained by our mainstream society to think in linear ways, be very efficient in what we do. These are the research papers I'm writing. This is the product I am launching. And we have become very oriented towards what is visible, what is technical, what is intellectual. And we have left out our feeling world, emotions. We have left out what I call more than human world. And we have left out, as I did at the beginning of this talk, a remembrance of ancestral energies. Perhaps many of you already do it, but maybe some of you don't pay attention to what difference does it make if I start a gathering with 2 minutes of silence and 2 minutes of remembering of, even if it's the scientist ancestors. Activist ancestors. And what is the energy, what is the force of that invisible realm? And a lot of this becomes way more powerful when we do it in natural, relatively wilderness settings, right? the natural quietness, beauty, diversity, energy of the natural world is extremely healing. And I know that the access to those places is not same. It's very different. But to the extent that we can connect with the natural world, there have been enormous number of studies, even scientific studies, showing how they are healing for us. So I want to go deeper into the framework for creating islands of resilience. One part which we have talked so far, only one part, is trauma resilience, so that we have healing individuals. Please notice that I do not say healed individuals. I think of this as a process, always healing. Yeah, we don't have to be finished. We don't have to be enlightened, completely healed to participate in movement for justice and peace and harmony, healing individuals. But then there are other two paths. In the Gandhian framework, if you know of Buddhist eco-philosopher Joanna Macy, Thich Nhat Hanh talked about in his work too, there are always two other components in addition to trauma healing. And those two components are what I call the strategic yes and the strategic no. The strategic yes is saying, what am I saying yes to in this life? This is bad, and this is bad, but what do I want to build? What am I saying yes to? And you can say, I'm saying yes to windmills and solar power, and I'm saying no to fossil fuel industry. But that's a very kind of, I would say, relatively speaking, a shallow response. We need to go way deeper, because this is not just about climate. It's not just about greenhouse gases. We have water issues, we have soil issues, we have air pollution. That's why we use the word polycrisis. This isn't just climate crisis. This is multiple crises facing us at the same time, and we need to multi-solve. We have 10 problems to solve, 10 equations to solve with a single, in a single homework. Okay, and we need to say no. But sometimes I have found with young activists, people are so passionate about saying no that we lose track of what are we saying yes to? Where is our joy coming from? Where is our energy and deepest motivation coming from? Yeah. So I really wanted to highlight that it's very important to know what are we a yes to even as we say no. And for some people, they are so busy in saying yes that they forget to create resistance. Resilience doesn't come just from working on trauma. Resistance has to be, saying our sacred no has to be part of our trauma healing. Right? It's not just enough to get humanitarian aid to an area where conflict is happening. There have to be pathways, even if we can't do it alone, to collectively do the no. Okay. Now, to deepen this idea of what are we saying yes to and no to, I want to tell you my experience. You might not agree with it. Why did, after 12 years of working in the mainstream climate movement with a very powerful organization called Environmental Defense Fund, why did I leave it? What was I looking for that wasn't there? I'm a scientist. We did an enormous good work, great number of publications and such. There was power, there was beauty. I love scientific equations. And I got frustrated with some things, and I call them put them in the bucket of reductionism. What do I mean by that? We did not have, when we are working with farmers, to measure wellness of a system, wellness of a farm at a systems level. And I'll talk about that. We sometimes, not always, but sometimes we'd be so narrowly focused on decreasing climate impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, that we'd forget the farmer also has a water problem, that the soil quality is poor, that the farmer is not getting high quality seeds on time, that the pesticides are contaminated with very, very toxic chemicals. Do you see? The solutions that science and policy world recommended, not always, but most times, was too narrow. It's like you go to a doctor with the problem that your nail is chipping off, and you go to your primary care, then they send you to a hand doctor, then they send you to a finger doctor, then you send you to a nail doctor, and your nail is chipping. And then some wise person say, dude, you are not just drinking enough water. You're dehydrated. That's why your nails are chipping. You just went through an entire list of experts trained by modern system, but you didn't have a holistic practitioner or elder in your community telling you, sweetheart, you just needed to drink more water and maybe put in more fruits and vegetables in your diet. So that's what I mean, wellness at an integrated systems level. Those measurements, I found them lacking. The other thing which I have referred to is that we had inability to address polycrisis and injustice in general. Even if there was willingness to look at justice issues, the framework that mainstream organizations work with to this day is, sadly, they don't have capacity. We are so tied to our goals, and rightly so, So all of these layers of polycrisis, geopolitical conflict, caste, religion, rural-urban divide, colonialism, legacy, trauma, mainstream organizations don't have a way to look at trauma, and it's eroding our power. Last 2 slides before we go to questions. Where am I putting my energy in? One is on my own trauma healing of the communities. And second, the frame I'm using more and more is, how do we honor indigenous knowledge systems? First, I'll give you a few statistics. Indigenous people are only 5% of human population on the planet, but they are guardians of 80% of world's biodiversity. Okay? And a third of forest carbon. This is not a coincidence. It is not just indigenous people happen to live in places that are just naturally rich in forest carbon and rich in biodiversity. Indigenous people live in Amazon, and Amazon is the most diverse place in the world. Nah. It is because they have for centuries been systems thinkers at a local level. What do I mean by systems thinkers? In mainstream universities, I am a product of that system. We study the science of plants in a different department, and a science of clouds. We study rivers, limnology. We study astronomy in a different field. But traditional ecological systems, the science of different ingredients of an ecosystem is passed on together. It's usually an oral tradition, but you don't become expert of a subject. You become expert of being in right relationship with one ecosystem. The curriculum is wholesome. See, even if I am a microbiologist, or let's say I am a soil scientist, if you drop me into an ecosystem in India, even though I am from India, I'm still very lost. Which crops will help the soil become healthier? Which cover crop is good for this region, right? And so on. But indigenous people have lived their lives in a way in which they are the keystone species of an ecosystem. Just like beaver is a keystone species, beaver, without beavers creating the dams, creating this artificial wetland, so many of the species in that ecosystem will not survive. They will not thrive. Indigenous peoples, wherever they have their power, they don't always have their power, but where they have their power, where the layers of trauma have not suppressed their power, they are acting like keystone species. They are in beautiful relationship with all species around them. And they have co-evolved with the ecosystem. That human world, more than human world, that ecosystem helps them with their trauma. They don't hesitate to shake their trauma out, make sounds. They sit around the fire. They have natural grieving circles. So I have developed a lot of respect for indigenous ways of being. This is just our lovely beaver being the keystone species. So what do I want you to leave? I want to leave you with this invitation to develop 4 kinds of sacred relationships. One is relationship with self, which is to work on our traumas, and hopefully not just with a therapist or one wise friend or so on, but in a community. May you all have ways to do that, because that builds power. Some ways to connect with human communities around us. First, in affinity groups, and then beyond our affinity group. Third invitation, which a lot of us urban people have lost connection with, is local ecosystems. Local ecosystems, so important to connect with them, again, for our own traumas, for our own healing, but also to get guidance. It might feel like a new agey thought, but rivers speak, mountains speak. They do, if we can make ourselves still and humble enough. Everything is imbued with intelligence. And then the 4th thing here on this list will seem vague. I will not explain it right now beyond what I have already said, but there is ancestral energy. There is notion of deep time, as many world spiritual traditions, non-dual traditions talk about, which is so essential. And as we work on these relationships to go towards indigenization, regardless of our own lineage, I do think we should, I hope we all can strive to support indigenous people in their trauma healing in their efforts to get their power, their languages, and land back, and then protecting their lives and land. The diverse ecosystems in Amazon, tribes around there have the maximum murder rates. Maximum murder rates. The keepers of world's most biodiverse places are constantly threatened by domestic and international forces. So all of these layers of work will only be possible if we get to invest in our own trauma healing. That will include slowing down, breathing deep, connection with different layers of our senses and communities and ecosystems. And I will not go over this slide, but just to say these things are always easier if you do them with 4 to 7 people. It's a magic number I share with folks. If the groups are too large, we become anonymous. If the groups are too small, we get busy. To bring intentionality to groups of 4 to 7 people, then you do your work, grief work, indigenization, and working on an action strategy. That is really helpful. That was my last slide. I have few people I like to acknowledge, but I'll just leave them on screen. I can share the slides later, so please don't worry about that. I'm gonna stop sharing and hand it over to Tia.
Thank you, Dr. Kanko. Thank you so much for weaving us through difficult material with the wisdom and kind support of your presence. I'd like to begin with the reality that you trained as a scientist, a climate scientist, and you trained as a Zen Buddhist. And when you offered us the 4 dimensions of sacred relationship, could you speak a little about the process of building an inner architecture that a tradition such as Zen or any other non-dual tradition provides? And the reason for the question is that your last point about the power of being in relationship with 4 to 7 people to really do the work of lived wisdom in the larger cultivation of these 4 levels of relationship is underemphasized in a world that is marketing large-scale distribution of apps, saying, you know, this is how you can reach non-dual states, this is how you can do breath. And also in the more recent richly funded research around psychedelics, which is bringing in a whole nother layer of people reading headlines in the news that you can reach non-dual states and you can have relief from climate despair if you use a psychedelic. And so the importance of my question is, what is the role of the inner architecture, not just a moment of aha in a meditation retreat or a psychedelic mediated moment, and then the role of being in the 4 to 7 group of people?
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure where the inner architecture, how are you holding that phrase, but I'll share a few things and maybe you can add to it, Tia, because I know you've thought about these things so much. One is traditionally indigenous cultures, Buddhist culture, shamanic world, any tradition you look at, you don't work with these spiritual teachings, these practices alone. There is always a sangha, there is a community. Whether it's 4 to 7 or if it's larger, embodied learning is important part of the architecture. Maybe it's not personal internal architecture, but the outer architecture of healing practices includes community. And I was lately, just a few weeks ago, reading an article which said people who brought these practices from East to the Western audience, they left out morality, they left out compassion practices, they left out responsibility and reciprocity and community out, and overemphasized enlightenment experiences, or what you call the aha experiences. Those aha experiences are real. There is something to be said about importance of having certain experiences and mind states. But those mind states without embodied experience of expressing those mind states in our daily lives, in community lives, is empty and sometimes outright harmful. I'm sure people have heard of abuse and scandals that rock spiritual communities from time to time. Yoga, psychedelic, Zen, Tibetan. When the architecture of these practices does not include humility, respect, reciprocity, it doesn't lead to healing, and it can also lead to wider harm. But please add, I invite you to jump in to see if I address your question fully.
You've addressed it beautifully, and I'll just extend your wisdom with another question, and that is, when you say the expression in daily action, and you also highlighted that in the dominant research models, there are no measures for looking at the well-being in a community. Would you talk about whatever comes to mind as an example? You had the image of the person using, I think it was 2 oxen or water buffalo, I don't know my animals well enough, to prepare for the use of that moist area, that marshland. What would a state of compassion, acknowledgement lead to in the behavior as a climate scientist, as what you would say that was not just how to reduce carbon emissions, just to animate this insight that you have and you live, so we can enter into what that would look like?
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful question. First, I'll say that marshy area that looked like marshy, the farmer was preparing it for transplanting rice. So it's a very common practice. You grow rice up to a specific height, it becomes like a seedling in a smaller area, nursery, and then you transplant those seedlings into a wider area. And before you do that, you puddle the field, you make it a little soggy. There is a whole lot of agronomic principles behind this. But in terms of what we would do, some of it we were already doing, and some of it mainstream nonprofits don't have potential to go that deep. One is to say, well, you sit down with every farming community, not necessarily a single farmer, but to really assess, what are your needs? They have agency. They have grown food for decades. They know what are the bottlenecks blocking their efficiency. A lot of greenhouse gas emissions come from inefficient systems. So farmers, if you give them right conditions, they have the best answer sometimes. So and a lot of organizations are trying to do that, to really survey the farming community deeply, to know what are their baseline conditions of seed, water, pesticide, herbicide, what are their constraints from their perspective, what are their needs, what are their solutions. um but I feel even when we are doing that, that is not enough. I think in the end, if I bring in the indigenization lens, I wouldn't even look at a farming community in its isolation. In an ideal world, you would look at the whole watershed. Where's the mountain? Where is the sacred river? Who were the indigenous tribes? What forest is growing? And uh, which crops were grown um, a few decades ago or centuries ago? How has the ecosystem changed? And really see integrated needs of the whole body of that ecosystem. What I'm trying to say is that mainstream science and policy divides things just like we divide our organs into different parts. We divide forests from farms, rivers from mountains, and we're not looking at the whole system. You know, beaver is able to be a keystone species through this deep knowing, or who knows how that evolved, right? A number of fish species, wetland species, come to be by that deep knowing. I don't know if it's making any sense, but what I am advocating for here is spending way more time with farmers before we jump in with our solutions, jump in with our interventions. And we are moving in that direction, but our lens are still shallow. Instead of looking at one variable of climate emissions or two variables, climate and water, what really needs to happen is you need to look at 50 variables, and we don't have ways to look at them. And this is the beauty of indigenous systems. They did look at 50 things together, because it wasn't just one expert looking at things, it was a lineage of wisdom about a local ecosystem that looked at a problem. So I'm not saying that we need to throw away modern science, not at all. What I am advocating for is an integration of mainstream science with traditional ecological knowledge. Does that make sense?
Yes, very clearly defined. Thank you. I'd also like to ask if you're aware of examples of that. I'm not thoroughly educated in the process happening in Australia, where there has been some effort for Indigenous voices to be included in the governing body of the nation. Could you speak to that? And I know after the fires in Maui, in Hawaii, there was also some coverage of potential to have Indigenous voices guide the way to rebuild.
Absolutely. I would say that Australia is doing some, New Zealand is really way ahead of the curve. Maoris have been really empowered, and I haven't studied in greatest detail, but they do have universities that are teaching indigenous cosmologies, indigenous ways of knowing their traditional ecological knowledges. Very systematically, they are being handed down. And then there is also integration of mainstream Western scientific models with indigenous models. Leila June, who's an indigenous scholar, musician, she was recently in New Zealand, and she made some great posts about the work they have done. You might want to check her social media posts about that. And I didn't look at Hawaii, but California as a state has definitely started leaning on indigenous wisdom around fire management. Um, so we are beginning to do that, and I feel like we need way more integration. And it will not happen without empowering indigenous elders who we are losing. They are aging. People who are real holders of this knowledge, they are dying. And there are very fewer and fewer people who know the nuances of their indigenous languages. It's in these nuances that different concepts from different disciplines are baked in. You know, language, indigenous languages contain so much depth. So yeah, that's what I can say in response to that. The name of the person I'm talking about, who has visited New Zealand, is Leila June.
Leila June, thank you. I'll move to another question. What insight did you gain while working for the large environmental activist organization into how we might convince such organizations to incorporate the kind of trauma healing work you've spoken about today and create space into their work environments for this kind of healing? How do we convince those organizations that dedicating time and resources to healing work is actually very in line with the organizational goals in the long term? And finally, what level of decision-making needs to be influenced?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, climate grief has become a mainstream topic. If you Google it, you'll find thousands, you know, literally. 4 or 5 years ago, there was very little, and now there's explosion. And so there is interest, there is curiosity, but mainstream organizations are very afraid. Just like we individually are afraid to be vulnerable, if you are a professor, if you are a leader in your university, it feels scary to admit that I am grieving, because we are trained to show power. We are trained to show excitement, positivity, optimism. And a lot of people are beginning to say, this is not honest. My honest truth is that I feel really sad about what is happening in this world. And so that leap is very hard for organizations, especially when you are in hierarchical model. How will the boss show their manager show their vulnerability to the staff that reports to them? How will it jeopardize power? So the mainstream organizations, universities are included in that, in my view. There are a few people who are doing experiments with this, but overall, at the larger level, we feel like it will jeopardize the way power operates. And power is related to, you know, some people call it white culture, European culture. In India, people are not so afraid of showing their vulnerability even to people who report to them. In general, I'm generalizing. But in the West, the fear is way more. I need to seem like I'm in control. I'm in control. How can I lose my thing? You know, how can I cry? So, which is very weird, because sometimes we accept anger, dominance, but somehow feeling anything that feels like it's going to show my weakness is, you know, it's hard to touch that. So I think about that very often. We keep bringing proposal to mainstream organizations in different way, and there is some openness, but not fully. The grassroots organization leaders are way more open. If you talk to leaders at Sunrise Movement, I have some dear people there, you know, they are like, let's do it. Younger people are more open in general. You know, I'm generalizing. I know we are out of time, so I'll stop talking, but thank you. That is a very important question, and I hope whoever asked it, you will keep asking it yourself. No one person will have answers that are relevant for all organizations.
Thank you for the depth of your insight and your practical guidance in these ideas. Thank you very much for your session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a blessed day, everyone, and the rest of your sessions go well. Bye-bye.